All right, good afternoon. We're ready to get the third and final panel started. There's a couple things I want to be able to announce in advance just to make sure people are aware of it as you come in. One, there are 7 AIA learning credits available, 6 of them HSW for those of you that are needing or seeking credits. Make sure you sign up on this, your email in particular and your name. If you don't have your AI number, we'll contact you to seek that number. But that's one of the offers that this gives you, which is 7 AIA credits. In addition, Woodworks wants to make certain that, following on a comment made earlier, that there is information available for understanding, learning, and getting support for using mass timber. There are flyers in the back in regards to Woodworks. Please take advantage of this. It has contacts and access in terms of websites to be knowledgeable about. But for the third panel of the Timbers in the City conference, for those of you who don't know, my name is David Lewis. I'm the principal of LTL Architects. This conference is indeed being sponsored by the Binational Softwood Lumber Council and the ACSA, which is coordinating the parallel student competition, also called Timber in the City. I'm very pleased to initiate this last panel, which will examine the interplay between forests and cities and the possible use of timber as a building material to address rapid urbanization and climate change, themes that have been coming up through the last 2 panels and keynote talk. The panel consists of David Linehan, a developer, Annie Perkins of the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, and Todd Snapp and Julie Michaels of Perkins+Will. Let me begin by introducing David Linehan. Trained and registered as an architect, David currently works as the development manager for Lotus Equity Group, a development company now undertaking the single largest mass timber commercial complex in America, specifically in New York, New Jersey, directly across the Hudson. David's commitment to the possibilities and future of timber from the standpoint of risk, logics, and economics has made him an important voice in the discussions of mass timber in the marketplace of development. Drawing on his years as an architect, working at shop, David is uniquely situated to speak to the creative possibilities and the immediate realities that inform the future of mass timber to address sustained and durable urban transformation. Will you please join in welcoming David?
Afternoon, everyone. Large crowd. Happy Friday, too. Can you all hear me okay? A little louder? Okay, how's this? All right, I have a bunch of disclaimers to make at the beginning of this talk. The first of them is that I'm not an expert in mass timber. I am an architect. I worked for years as an architect. I now have gone over to the dark side. I work for developers as a development manager. The specifics of how mass timber is done and how it's designed and how it's manufactured, I'm not an expert in those things. I'm here today to talk about the reasons why we're trying to use it, specifically on our project. The second disclaimer has to do with this deck. This presentation deck is cobbled together from work from a very large team that we've employed on our job. And so I ask that you forgive any issues with graphic coherence. The last disclaimer that I'll make is that while this is a Timber in the City conference, I'm not going to start by talking about timber. Instead, I'm going to start from the city. To my way of thinking and approaching things as a person who manages the development of large projects, we have to start with the where, the who, and the what of the project that we've undertaken before we get to the why of mass timber as a building option for the development of urban sites. The city in our case is Newark, New Jersey. It's a city with a proud and by American standards a long history. It's always been a dense and mixed-use urban environment. It has a deep cultural legacy and has produced a startling number of people who've impacted the music, art, and literature scenes in the U.S. Like other formerly industrial cities in the Northeast and in the Rust Belt, it was partially left behind by changes in the nation during the second half of the 20th century. But it's always remained there, holding on to its character, its core of office buildings and higher education, and its status as New Jersey's largest city by population. Lotus Equity Group, who I work for, through its sister company, C&K Properties, has been in Newark since 2006. We were introduced to Newark with the purchase of the largest existing office building in the downtown area. It's a 2-gateway center that you see here. During that time, we've discovered that Newark has a special mix of qualities, starting with its location and regional connectivity. Between New Jersey Transit, PATH, the Newark Light Rail, Amtrak, the highways, the port, and Newark Liberty International Airport, which is the easiest airport to use in the region. It has unparalleled access not only to New York City, but to the entire Northeast region and beyond. As an example, from our site that we're developing in downtown Newark, it's a 17 to 20 minute train ride on New Jersey Transit directly into New York City Penn Station. This is coupled with a substantial urban infrastructure and the scale of an existing major city, as well as with the digital infrastructure that exceeds the quality of New York City's due to Newark's legacy as a major hub of telephone service in the country. The other thing that Newark has is both the need for and the capacity to provide substantial amounts of middle-class housing that is affordable by market standards rather than by government program. Now, what exactly do we mean by that? We mean the kind of housing that supports the long-term growth and sustainability of the workforce in the greater New York City and northern New Jersey area. The kind of housing that is targeted at those making roughly 70 to 120% of area median income, rather than a housing market that is primarily focused on attracting the very wealthy, combined with the provision of government-mandated housing at the 40% of AMI and below level. So the kind of housing that we're talking about here is the kind of housing that Lotus is not alone in recognizing is at the core of a housing crisis in our region, because we're not producing enough of it to satisfy the demand that's coming. In order to advance our plans to address this need, we found ourselves a mostly unused minor league baseball stadium, which you see here on the screen. It's the former home of the Newark Bears, which was, sadly, they went under, I think, in the late 90s. But the city had built this baseball stadium in the early 90s for the team. It's currently just used for a couple of universities in the area. So we found ourselves this minor league baseball stadium on a full block site, including an outdated parking garage. And then we took the empty lot that's directly across the street that backs up to the rail line in this picture. All of these are located at the north end of downtown Newark, and all of them are directly across the street from a major commuter rail hub at the Broad Street Station. We then put together a group of the best architects, engineers, planners, landscape architects, marketing and PR advisors, brokers, acousticians, traffic consultants, and lawyers that we could find. I do that partly as a joke because it's a large project, but I do want to give special mention to Vishan Chakrabarty in Practice for Architecture and Urbanism, who is the planner for the project as well as one of the design architects. Michael Green Architecture, who is the design architect for the office building that I'll be showing today. And 10 Arquitectos, Enrique Norton, is also an architect for us. And Signe Nielsen of Matthews Nielsen Landscape Architecture, who's doing the site. So we put together this team, and we set about planning and designing a 7-phase, high-density, transit-oriented development on our 12-acre site. We call this little development Riverfront Square. In total, it'll add up to about 5 million square feet when all phases are done. In its initial 4 phases, which in this diagram, the tall buildings in the background, those are later phases. We're not really focused on those for the time being. But in the initial 4 phases, which take up the full stadium site, as well as a piece across the street, we're looking to bring 1,300 rental apartments, 500,000 square feet of Class A office space, up to 90,000 square feet of retail, and roughly half the site will be given back over to publicly accessible open space. Together with our design team, our approach in bringing this sort of density to the central ward of Newark is founded on the belief that planning should be driven by incorporating true mixed-use neighborhoods into the existing urban infrastructure. Ground level, publicly accessible, and programmable open space balances the high-density development throughout the site, encouraging people to leave their cars behind and activate the streetscape and ground plane. Neighborhood scale retail feeds off of and further encourages active streets at the ground level of our buildings throughout. So we're incorporating ground floor retail all through and surrounding and activating our open space. And then we plan for office use in close proximity to the residential in order to support the retail and put people on the streets during the workday. Finally, quality, affordable residential is planned to be introduced in 2 phases. First, in this 733-unit Phase 1 building being designed by Practice for Architecture and Urbanism, and then in a subsequent phase of 580 units over 4 massings broken up by additional open space, which is being designed by 10 Arquitectos. At Riverfront Square, we're building on the changes that we see happening around us in downtown Newark today. We're also trying to accelerate them. Rather than waiting for this type of urban environment to grow organically over many years, we are focusing on an effort to deliver all 4 interlocking aspects of a healthy mixed-use urban environment: the housing, the office, the retail, and the open space at one time. In order to make cities work, we can't just have more office built exclusively, nor do we want isolated residential communities with no activity during the day. To use a developer cliche that is true and that we actively embrace, work, play, and live all in one place. Which brings me finally to the point of what we're here to discuss this afternoon. What does mass timber have to do with the redevelopment of an urban environment like downtown Newark? What does it have to do with the efforts to create density at an urban scale and solve issues of the availability of truly affordable housing? Building on the notion that successful neighborhoods should have all 4 of the ingredients that I listed, we've planned to incorporate a significant amount of new Class A office space into the first phases of our site in order to complement the other uses. And this is a rendering. Both of these last 2 renderings are renderings of the buildings that, the office building that Michael Green is designing for us, the mass timber building. This is a view from the outside as you approach the site. Now, the issue here is that Newark already has a large stock of existing office space and a strong and stable office core. For years, the difficulty has been in getting new residents and tenants to relocate there. Ultimately, they will do so for reasons of price, quality of infrastructure, and regional connectivity. Downtown Newark has the infrastructure and the connectivity, and we are making the housing and the retail to go along with it. So provided that you can supply high-quality new office space in this environment at a significant discount to the markets like New York City, we think that tenants will come. There are 3 main reasons that we are looking at mass timber as the construction method of choice for this new office space. First, there's the environmental story. Developers and tenants both are aware that new and more environmentally sustainable methods of construction must be encouraged and developed. We have to continue to build to serve the needs of our society. In order to do so, we must look to technologies that will consume less energy, produce less carbon, and maybe even act as carbon sinks in the way that timber does. The second reason is the quality of the interior environment in mass timber buildings. And my apologies to another developer. This is Michael Green's building in Minneapolis, Minnesota. This is the interior, right before they did the interior fit-outs for the tenants. But we love to show this image because it's an inspirational image for the quality of the space that you can get on the interior of a mass timber building. Employee attraction and retention are concerns for every company. And if you can provide a space that prioritizes natural materials and daylighting in a way that traditional office space does not, then you have a leg up on the competition. The third reason that we're looking at mass timber, and this is a rendering of what the interior of our building might look like. The third reason we're looking at mass timber is prefabrication. Because mass timber elements are prefabricated off-site and weigh less, we have an easier building process all around. The foundations do not need to be as substantial as they are in traditional buildings. Shipping to site can be more efficient. Construction and assembly times are significantly less for these buildings. And the on-site work is replaced with off-site work to a larger degree than in a traditional building. All of these factors potentially add up to significant savings in time and therefore in the cost of construction, which is what we're currently invested in trying to demonstrate. The fact is that the cost of new construction in this area is driven largely by the New York City market. deploying new technologies to save significant amounts of cost on projects like ours is fundamental to their ability to compete in pricing and therefore succeed. We are therefore looking to use timber to achieve these three objectives and combine it with smart and attractive designs, focusing on flexibility of layout. For instance, in our typical floor plans here, we have a 50,000 square foot open floor plate that can be subdivided with side-loaded cores to keep the services away from the major open spaces on site, which are on the right-hand side of the page. And we've combined this with a three-part massing for the building with 2 points of entry at the ground floor, which allow for through building lobbies from the street to the open space in the middle. And this gives us the flexibility to divide the building and gives tenants either full floors for maximum horizontal area or vertical stacking to allow for a single tenant to have their own mini office building within the larger structure, complete with separate lobby and services. We're also looking to add rooftop terraces as an amenity, and then the all-important ground floor amenity retail spaces that integrate the building seamlessly into the rest of the project. With continuous retail fronting onto our major open space on site, and a scale for the building and an exterior expression that can fit in conjunction with the residential portions of the neighborhood that we're building all around us. These are a couple more views as you sort of walk around the outside of the building, and they give you a sense for how both the scale and the wood, which is prominently displayed in the design, are helping to work this, what is a substantial, a fairly large building, we're talking about 500,000 square feet, into a residential neighborhood and into an open space more or less seamlessly. One last view here of the entry into the building, and what your lobby might look like if you were working in this building. It's a double height space that Michael Green's office has designed. And then the last image that I'll show here, this is a view from the exterior of our site, looking up Atlantic Street at night with the New Jersey light rail, which stops, the Newark light rail, which stops right at the front door of our building. And so that's sort of the general approach to the why of why we've taken a serious pass here at proposing 500,000 square foot office building in a market where mass timber is not currently being used or not being used at this kind of scale. But now I have to discuss sort of a summary of the issues that we're actively wrestling with right now in terms of trying to adopt mass timber on a project like this. The first is the questions of safety. This is something that's being addressed continuously, but it'll be an ongoing process. And I find when I present this building, which I do a lot to prospective tenants, and when I talk to code officials and government officials, safety is always a concern. Most people, I found, are open to the discussion of why mass timber is different from stick-built construction and how it performs in fires, and that it may even outperform other materials. But it's important that we as an industry remember to continue to address these questions in a calm and thoughtful manner because people are going to keep asking them. The second issue is the issue of the regulatory environment. And in this area, the U.S. is at risk of being left behind by other countries. I think it's already starting to happen. So while the codes are changing, and I don't know, there may have been other discussions during this panel, or during this conference of the code changes that are happening at a national level. While they're changing, they're not doing so quickly or thoroughly enough, for my taste anyway. While the codes will allow for taller and larger structures, including what we're showing here, we think, they're going to do so by requiring that large percentages of the timber potentially be covered up by other materials like drywall. And we have to be honest about this. When the quality of the exposed wood interior is one of the major motivations for building this way, it's an issue that we have to solve. And so if we believe in the science that says that these buildings are safe, and then the testing that says that these buildings are safe, we have to keep pushing on the code aspect in order to get those aspects of the code relaxed. And that's something that we're working on. It's sort of TBD as to how far they'll let us go. The third major issue currently is supply chains. This is a growing part of the construction market, and we at Lotus are eagerly looking for new manufacturers and suppliers to set up shop regionally so that we can be true to the environmental and cost aspects here. You know, for trucking mass timber all the way across the country or from Canada may not be the best solution. But this is something that we expect to find out more about in the next year, and hopefully it catches up with where we are. The last question, which is applicable specifically to our project, is whether or not we might see some of our later housing phases looking to adopt mass timber structure in the way that the office is. And we would be open to that idea, but the jury's still out. I think first we have to prove that the cost, the supply, and the regulatory issues are all solvable, because we know it can work from an engineering standpoint. And so that, in summary, is the issues as we see it. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.
No conference on the future of timber can speak adequately about sustainability without addressing the health and vitality of the forests from which the timber comes. To paraphrase the Norwegian forester, the answer is the forest. What's the question? I'm very pleased, therefore, to introduce Andy Perkins to this panel. And he is a longtime advocate for sustainable forestry materials, having spent years pursuing and contributing to wood product rules in the window industry. Currently, she is the Senior Director of Strategic Partnerships at Sustainable Forestry Initiatives, SFI, which is a not-for-profit organization dedicated to building a community connected to working forests and providing supply chain assurances through standards and data. And it brings to this discussion years of work with certification process, leads, and engagement with WELL, focused on human health and on wellness. Will you please join with me in welcoming Annie Perkins.
Before I get started, I have to say I feel really comfortable here on Fifth Avenue, even though I had nothing to do with the T3 building at all. I do live in Minnesota, and Minneapolis has been mentioned numerous times, so thanks for all the shout outs and kudos for that. And then after last night, Andrew's introduction, keynotes speech, I felt really good about the fact that I get really much more quality sleep every night when I go to bed, because I'm surrounded by wood beams and wood ceilings, and the whole envelope is wood. So I feel really good about that. And then I woke up this morning, was working on just the final things in my hotel room, and I just about went berserk because the incessant jackhammering noise right outside the window, and I thought, oh my gosh, those poor guys out there constantly, I can't even take 5 minutes of it. So the prospective benefits all across the board with more construction using timber, to me is really exciting. So thanks again, and I'm going to talk about the use of timber and the expansion of urban construction, and why using certified lumber is so valuable and critical to us all. So I'll just touch a little bit about SFI, Sustainable Forestry Initiative, who we are, what we do, the benefits of sustainable forestry practices, of course mass timber, CLT, which you guys know far more than I do, and then basically focus on the rural communities, preserving those communities and also bolstering their economic viability. So who are we? SFI is a sustainability leader dedicated to the future of our forests. The future of our forests depends on strengthening the connections between sustainable forests, thriving communities, and also responsible purchasing. Why sustainable forests matter? I have to push 2 buttons, by the way. I'm feeling very talented. Left hand's here, right hand's here. So if it gets screwed up, that's why. As we know, forests provide many benefits, such as the clean air that we breathe. It filters the water that goes through the forest, ends up in our watersheds. The water that we recreate and we drink is all thanks to the quality of forests. Obviously, habitat and the wildlife need the forests to thrive and live and have diverse ecosystems. We procure valuable products from the forests, and of course, forests provide employment opportunities for local communities. In addition to that, trees absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere as they grow. They provide us clean, refreshing oxygen, and they sequester carbon as well. This all reduces our overall greenhouse gases and improves the indoor air, or not indoor air, improves air quality. However, there are threats to the forest. Deforestation, illegal logging, and unsustainable forestry practices are still a threat worldwide. However, in North America, our strong laws and frameworks such as certification standards mean that we get to focus on the benefits of responsible forestry and forest certification that go beyond reducing the risk of deforestation. So many of these positive attributes of wood depend in part on whether the forest resource is renewed. Third-party certification standards offer a proof point that forests have been managed for multiple environmental, social, and economic values today and into the future. We've seen this statistic a few times today. It's quite alarming to me that on average, we all spend 90% of our time indoors. It's just super disturbing and alarming. The earlier panel spoke about occupant health and well-being being achieved through biophilia and the benefits of bringing the outdoors in. And of course, there's studies from decades ago that hospital patients with views to nature had a faster recovery time and less requirement for pain meds with the view of nature and bringing nature in. But there's even more. Now, cross-laminated timber and mass timber construction projects offer speed, efficiency, and lighter environmental footprint as previous traditional processes. So now, in addition to the intrinsic beauty and health benefits to occupants associated with wood and natural materials. The momentum, oopsie, there we go. The momentum of tall buildings, are we okay?
Yeah, just shift this. Go to full screen.
Oh, you got the whole thing. Yeah. You see everything now. I wasn't supposed to touch it. I did not touch it. The momentum of tall buildings being proposed and realized around the world is creating an irreversible trend, says Michael Green. This means that architects need to be sourcing more wood and that we need to feel secure that the wood's coming from proper chain of custody and both really good certification standards and processes. When I ran across cross-laminated timber, I got very excited because it was a chance to build beautifully, a chance to build sustainably, and a chance to really begin to introduce lower carbon emitters with higher sequestration of carbon into our supply chain, says Susan Jones. So chain of custody certifications are a meaningful step forward in this direction. So with the expansion of mass timber construction and the increased use of forest products, how do we ensure that our use of wood in buildings doesn't negatively affect the rural communities in which it originates? Moreover, how can we bolster the economic viability of those communities? By taking a holistic view and ensuring that the connections and engagement remain strong and meaningful between supply chain, conservation, educational and community leaders, we demonstrate and enhance our shared quality of life while providing supply chain assurances through standards, data, and authentic dialogue. Forests play a critical role in achieving the United Nations Global Development, Sustainable Development Goals related to water, biodiversity, climate change, and carbon sequestration. SFI is committed to doing our part in contributing to the UN's SDGs. And while our work touches on all 17, we're really particular to 5 that have the greatest impact. Goal 6 ensures access to water and sanitation for all. As you know, forests are key to water. So our standards mandate best practices relating to water quality, and our conservation and grant program promotes projects that focus on improving water quality and quantity in forests. These two are flipped, so we're starting with 13 and then we'll go to 12, don't know why. Take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts and ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. So extensive research and grants are used to identify best practices in well-managed forests to increase carbon storage and resiliency to climate change. Also, supply chain assurance achieved via certification ensures responsibly sourced materials. So goal 15 speaks to sustainably managed forests, and goal 17 strengthens the mean of implementation and revitalize global partnerships for sustainable development. Certification supports sustainable forests, fosters community and engagement and education to reduce deforestation, and promotes ecosystem health and protection of at-risk species. Collaboration with forest sector, brand owners, conservation groups, indigenous people, and more really promote the shared goal of sustainable forests. So, how do we achieve this? Proper oversight and diversity within our managing board, and having our three pillars, economic, environmental, and social, equally represented within and across the board, ensures the core values are properly carried out in all we do. For example, by preserving the heritage of minority and marginalized family land ownership through forestry, SFI is committed to engaging diverse and non-traditional forest owners in the U.S. South. It's through these partnerships that families can continue to maintain and get value from long-held family forests. Our research requirements, unique among certification standards, add real value and understanding regarding the conservation contributions of managed forests. So it's kind of a busy slide, but bottom line is that last year alone, $59 million was invested in forest research on behalf of all program participants related to SFI, so forests, millworks, paper pulp. I don't know if you can see it, but the pie chart in the middle that has nothing on it other than colors is denoted to the left. So the biggest bulk of that spend was forest health and productivity, and then next up was wildlife and fish, then landscape ecosystem management, biodiversity, forest operations, efficiencies and economies, water quality, and so on. The conservation research is then translated into forest management practices through conservation grants, focused on advancing our shared understanding of conservation benefits associated with well-managed forests across the United States and Canada. We take an active role in working with grantees to help clarify the connection between sustainable forest management, responsible supply chain choices, and the environmental benefits that we all care about and that we all need and rely upon. So specific to education and community engagement is the SFI community, made up of 34 regional implementation committees throughout the US and Canada. They offer a forum to provide information and or answer questions about local forestry operations, work with local organizations and individuals, providing leadership and sharing best practices to improve forest management on both certified and uncertified lands. Since 1995, SFI program participants have contributed over $65 million to support local programs through these implementation committees. Project Learning Tree is part of SFI, and it is an environmental education program for kindergarten through grade 12. PLT envisions a future where the next generation values nature and our forests and has the knowledge and skills to make informed decisions and to take responsible actions to sustain them as well. So part of ensuring a future of healthy, sustainable forests is to cultivate today's youth in jobs related to continuing sustainable forestry management practices. So PLT Canada is helping to place 1,600 students in green jobs through their Green Jobs in Green Spaces program. Oops. So 96% of forests certified to the SFI standard is available to the public for outdoor recreation. Every year, millions of hunters, anglers, hikers, campers, and other outdoor enthusiasts use their lands as their playground. The value of connecting people to the outdoors and to the natural environment in this way is invaluable. SFI has identified the needs of underserved communities and their relationship to forests and sustainable supply chains as an important area of attention in our community engagement programs. As an example, loss of African American land ownership in the South has been precipitous. From 1982 to 2000, the number of African American farmers declined by 45%. Families continue to lose ownership across generations and have historically been underserved by traditional outreach programs. And we believe there's a role to be played in working with the local nonprofits. So I made my font bigger, and now I ran out of room. But basically, we're working with the local nonprofits to help keep those forests and those families longer so that they can engage in the management process, practices, and also have it be a viable economic source for them as well. So SFI certified lumber and wood products is a proof point for responsible forestry and is the cornerstone of green building. There are many green building rating systems and codes that recognize the value of certification standards and responsibly sourced wood and offers credits for certified products within their rating system. With that, you can see that there's an extensive network of critically important, necessary work that goes behind the scene of a label of certified wood, of SFI certified wood, and this is a vital to ensuring sustained forest and wood products for future generations. So I hope that you can support that.
The architecture of the city of Chicago has long been defined by the innovative use of steel to create a new urban type, the skyscraper. Yet under the impact of the next speakers, Chicago may be known as the city of timber towers. Todd Snapp is a principal of Perkins+Will. Julie Michaels is a senior project designer also at Perkins+Will, and both have worked on the River Beach Tower project, a speculative 80-story timber tower to be located on the east bank of the Chicago River. Todd and Julie come to this project with a vast arsenal of architectural imagination, born through work on highly acclaimed K-12 schools, mixed-use developments, and cultural facilities in over 3 decades of combined years at Perkins+Will. Please welcome Todd and Julie to the stage.
First thing I just like to give an indication about this, and especially the topic. It's just a really nice opportunity to take what's been about a 2-year research project that we've undertaken in the Chicago office, which is a collaboration between Perkins+Will, Thornton Thomas Betty, structural engineers, and their facade engineering department, and the University of Cambridge. We call it River Beach Tower now. It's had many names over the years, but I think the little play on words with beach will make sense in a little bit when we get through the presentation. But I thought I'd start with a little background. I'm originally from Cincinnati, Ohio. Sorry. Oh, can everyone hear me? Oh, oops. Better? So, like I was saying, I'm originally from Cincinnati, Ohio, and for about 8 years before I determined I wanted to be an architect, I spent a lot of that time actually in the construction industry, building what you see on the left, mostly stick-built suburban single-family homes. It was typically crews of 4 to 5 people, 6 months, 6-month time frame. And then in the mid-90s, I moved to Chicago, which is on the right, which was the exact opposite of what I was used to, and started architecture school and just thought, wow, I'm really out of my league now. So in school, I actually took a job with a furniture design company for about 3 years, which just gave me another sort of smaller scale perspective on what it meant to just work with timber and wood in a much different scale. Fast forward 20 years, which on the screen now is a project that Julie and I have been working on for about past 3 or 4 years or so. It's about 4 million square feet of concrete, basically. Residential project on the south branch of the Chicago River. And what's unique about this project, and this image here, pointer, this is our site right here. This is an image from the mid-20s when they actually straightened the Chicago River. So the Chicago River used to take this little hook here, and just to increase the traffic flow, the barge traffic down the river, they undertook a massive straightening of the river. It just so happens that half of our site used to be the Chicago River. So a lot of the soil conditions were just infill. We were just learning about the site as we're working on this master plan. And then as we were working with the client, there were two buildings that were mid-rise, about six stories or so. The client really wanted us to look at how we could use timber for the structure, mostly due to the weight, the bad soil, the lightness of the timber relative to concrete, was really something we spent probably 6 months developing a concept that wasn't allowed to be built. This is our site. This is a map of the Chicago fire in 1871. The thing to note about this image is right at the edge of the screen on the left is where the Chicago Fire District starts, which is a much more strict zone of fire regulations. So basically the opposite side of our property, we could possibly do a 5 or 6 story building. We just so happen to be on the north side of that limit, which was really frustrating, and especially looking at Chicago, home of balloon frame housing, tall steel buildings, and now we're in the 21st century, and there's an opportunity to actually use this in a way that works. And it just so happened, as we were working on this master plan, we were approached by University of Cambridge, their material sciences division, and they wanted to partner with a design and engineering firm to study what tall timber could be, and not in the sense of taking a concrete structure and just converting it to timber, but really starting with a blank slate and asking and going through an iterative process of what does it want to be. As architects, I think part of the beauty is we're able to be neutral, finding the most appropriate material for the right application. Steel, concrete, timber, they all act differently. And at the end of the day, I don't really care what material we're using as long as it makes sense and it actually performs. This is just something that kind of quantifies the potential. If you step back and think about timber, an apartment for 2 requires about 30 square meters of timber. 6 mature trees can produce 30 square meters of timber. Americans use 6 trees per year for paper alone. So that just really kind of puts in perspective, one home comes out of 6 trees, and then Canada is 1 billion people, can generate enough for 1 billion people. So for the past 2 years, we've just been kind of iterating this diagram here. How do we take timber, think of it in the context of a smaller scale, but then push it to a limit, and what does that mean? So the first step of the research was really to just set some quantifiable variables. There were so many paths that we could go down. Every time you'd sort of think about something, it raised about 20 other questions. So we wanted to take a more phased approach. And the specific variables we gave were residential. It made, partly because it was the master plan we were working on. This is a 10-year master plan. We thought that time frame, it gives us something to look forward to in some ways, both from a modular and a materiality perspective. We also wanted it to be site specific. So we wanted to have a specific site that we could look at using readily available materials and then just think of how we could engineer and produce those. If we were going to do this, why not push the limits? 800 feet is actually, it's a reasonable size for a residential tower. So we set that as the goal for the height. And then we wanted to really just solve for structure at this first phase. So the purity of the material, everything that we designed and engineered would be out of timber. The cores, the stairs, everything. So this is where we started. We took just your normal, typical residential floor plate. They vary, but average about 80 feet by 160 feet. We essentially extruded that to 800 feet tall. Thornton Tomasetti did some quick engineering analysis and came back and said basically the bottom third of the building had to be solid timber for this to stand up. So taking, just a normal, just taking the typology and seeing what that means, not that that's necessarily what we wanted to end up with, but it gave us the opportunity to step back and say, what does that mean? So this all happened, the first stage of this all happened over about a 2 or 3 day workshop. So what we did was step back and said, what if we split that floor plate in half along the corridor and gave it a broader aspect ratio at the base, almost like an I-beam. So we started thinking of 2 residential bars connected with a central atrium and cross bracing. And then in parallel to that, what type of structure was the most appropriate? Again, what does timber want to be? And one way I like thinking about this diagram, well, we studied 2 scenarios. One, which is typical slab and column, or post and beam, and the other was a diagrid. And the way I like to think about this and the diagrid became sort of the natural shape that timber wanted to work in this context. And if you think about a tree, right? Trunk, branches grow almost at a 45-degree angle. So sort of going back to the intrinsic properties of the material, it was just interesting to land on that as the most appropriate configuration. And then these were some of the early sketches of just trying to layer in, the reality of that. Two bars separated by an atrium, connected with cross bracing, and then single loaded corridor, elevators on both sides. And we wanted to throw in a few anomalies as well, since we were studying this instead of just extruding it. And the sketch over here in section and elevation were more or less inspired by our master plan. We had an opportunity to cantilever over a 30-foot riverwalk setback. So we said, let's see what it means to throw a cantilever into this situation. And then also having an atrium, we wanted to embed opportunities for cross ventilation through the atrium as well. So how could we start to layer in some environmental qualities into this? And the other thing and what does it mean if you don't have 2 sides connected by the cross bracing? So we carried a 200-foot single bar up the north side. And the other thing that started to become important as we did some more of the engineering analysis was these diaphragms at every 200 feet. So that started getting us to think a little more about what that atrium space could be and the potential. So we refined everything. This is a snippet of about 30 pages of engineering analysis that we did on the tower, showing all of those variables that we worked into the scenario and all of the reactions. And then, like I mentioned earlier, the design really came out of that iteration. So it wasn't only an engineering exercise, but also just thinking about the qualities of the space, the environments we were creating. There were about 4 of us in the office. Julie's here. She's focuses a lot on interiors in our firm. So we all got together and just, the engineering gave us this, but what's the potential, the further potential of that? This is a blow up of the systems, and the thing to take away from this is each component of the massing is very intentionally a different type of timber. We needed the stiffness of LVLs for the 2 bars, so the diagrid is all LVL material. floor slabs, CLTs, and then the cross bracing was glulam. We wanted to push the dimension of that as much as we could. And also think about what type of facade could work with that. So the glulams work best in the cross brace situation, and then considering ETFE or lightweight material for the infill. And this is a interesting, almost optical illusion rendering. When we first started designing the aperture of the diagrid, to get to a proportion of the mullions, we said we want an 8-foot square window at the base. That was because obviously the structure gets lighter the taller it gets, the structure gets lighter. So we set that parameter at the most extreme point. And this is actually a tier of 7 different structural sizes as you go up the building. We set the depth as the fixed element, and then the width decreases the taller the tower gets. But it's interesting, the rendering, they all look the same size from some, I don't know, I guess, ironic coincidence. Here, you want that?
So I don't know if you guys heard today, but we spend 90% of our time indoors. I'll totally reiterate that. And as Todd mentioned, a lot of my focus is on interior design and interior architecture in our practice. And so a lot of what excited me about this project were some of the things that we heard about from Bill and from Allison as well with regards to biophilia and healthy materials, and the fact that those are inherent qualities of a building like that, and what can we do to express those and emphasize those and activate them even further. So how can we be inspired by those? And I think what was interesting is what came out of the structural studies were these opportunities for spaces that came into the building that weren't things that we are looking at doing in a concrete or steel structure. And so when Todd mentioned every 20 stories that we have the diaphragm, that's a great opportunity in my mind to bring park space and open space to those upper levels. And I think that the opportunities, so these aren't things that we've studied in depth yet, but these are kind of the next steps of where we're going with this. As Todd said, we're doing this iteratively. The structure was kind of the first thing to solve for. And now that we know what works for that, what are the next set of opportunities and iterations? And we think that this could really bring, satisfaction to everybody involved, from maybe the developer standpoint of, does this have the potential to satisfy open space requirements in a footprint that otherwise might not be able to for the capacity of this building? And we did push ourselves primarily for this to be a residential building, but we do see that this could, to what David was speaking about, be a true mixed use community where office could start coming up into this. How do you activate it on a more 24-hour basis where you have retail, you have office, you have residential in this building, and the open space to support it at those upper levels. And going, taking that a step further, like how could we look at, we've talked a lot about urban farming and creating and growing our own food. Could we have urban forestry? Could this building give back building materials? So I think those are some of the exciting opportunities that we're looking at in the next phases of this. So looking at what that space might be like, and Todd, as Todd mentioned, this is one of those upper level park areas, a light ETFE skin, and this atrium that's breathable. And I think another thing that's important in Chicago, in Minneapolis, and some of our here in New York is extending seasonality as well. So this building helps provide those opportunities too. So we're like so sad that summer's coming to a close, but it could live on in this space. We took a long look at how the materials start coming together. So as where does the glass want to be? What is the cladding? How is it going to weather? What is the energy, considerations for the skin itself? And so these are some thermal studies and looking at, where the glazing is placed relative to the timber structure. And ultimately we decided the glazing at the exterior would be the best approach, and so we would be cladding it on the exterior with aluminum fin. And what that allows is the timber itself to be the structure for the facade. The aluminum is really just a cladding for weather protection and solar control, so we can vary the depth of that aluminum fin to help, tune it for each of the facades for solar orientation.
For this exercise, we were just let's take advantage of every property we possibly can.
Timber
and see
had
what
to
it
do
means.
it all.
But the weathering was, it actually, the previous diagram, I think it would have been more efficient to build it with the timber exposed on the outside and have the glazing inside. But not only the weathering consideration, but also the fact if you're building a 800-foot tall residential building, do you really want to be behind a sheet of glass and see the wood outside, or do you want it in your space?
I was getting
So,
that.
it was only that, there were the technical reasons, but there's also those kind of human reasons.
So getting back to the housing materials and the biophilia in particular, to Todd's point, is that allowed us to keep the timber expressed on the interior where people are in contact with it. So these were just to look at some of the unit. He touched on this briefly, but that we looked at a duplex unit. And again, we were trying to push the focus on residential here and trying to maintain efficiency. So splitting the building apart didn't sound like the most efficient move, but how could we, how could we recuperate some of that circulation space so that we're not doubling our circulation space, which is never preferred by any developer I've worked with. And then just a view of this in elevation. This one kind of makes me laugh. Like, all your friends and family are going to come over because it's such a great space to be in. There's like way too many people in this one unit, but.
So again, this whole process for 2 years, it's really just, we've let it evolve on its own. So when we started thinking more closely about the fact that this is residential and still forcing ourselves to think of the whole structure being timber, we started just stepping back and thinking about prefabrication opportunities and essentially creating A and B modules, where the A modules would be units only, and the B modules would be units with whatever core elements would be required. And this diagram also shows those three distinct timber elements: the LVLs at either side of the bar, the glue lams tying the atrium together, and the CLTs. So this is a rendering that just essentially just illustrates a typical module, 30 foot by 30 foot by 2 stories tall. So let's just think of these as prefabricated pods that also could take advantage of Chicago and its location to Lake Michigan. You have the lake, you have Canada up here, and we have the river. So how can we take this almost underutilized infrastructure that cuts right through the city, and a lot of underutilized site on the south side, bring materials in, create large-scale prefabrication facility on the south side, barge these modules up, bring them down the river, and really, you can think about this in almost any urban context that has waterways, and when it was mentioned earlier about material sourcing, and you have trains, trucks, whatever. Let's look a little harder at this. So the river just started to become a very important story in what we were analyzing. So we started looking at capacity of barges. How many of these could we fit on a barge? How many of these could we build up at one time before we actually had to start tying them together? And then essentially, just think about it as a set of Legos almost, and stack it up. Rendering, just showing in context, and also just, again, these diaphragms, these courtyards at every 200 feet, just creating the opportunity to bring that green space up into the tower. It was almost this unintentional opportunity that really the design process gave us. View to the city. So here's where we're at now. We started calling this phase one of the research. We've kind of proved out the structural opportunities. And now we're looking at two different approaches to think about scalability in a different way. One is the more finite aspects of a single module. But then what does it mean when you start stacking these modules together and the movement between them? This one's almost easy in some ways. This is where it gets really complicated when you start to think of height. So master plan at the top, it's under construction. One of the buildings opens, I think, in a week.
Thursday.
Thursday. But as we were working on the research, the client needed a sales center, so they thought it would be a nice opportunity to start testing this at a smaller scale. So we took advantage of that opportunity and designed a small sales center that was really based on a lot of the principles of the tower. And if you look at this, it's basically the top of the building, right? So down here, not so much. Up here, well, we could start looking at that. So that's where we saw the opportunity of just thinking about this in a little more detail. This sketch, sorry, it's so bad quality, it's hanging on my wall. It's a photograph, but this is actually an official approved document. Like I mentioned, we're in the fire district. No combustible construction allowed at all unless you have a really good story. So we brought this rendering to the city along with the whole proposal and sat down with the fire commissioners, the building commissioners, and they thought we were completely insane when we first sat down, but then we started.
I think we also took the 800-foot tall tower with us.
Yes, that was the first thing that we showed them, and which set up the story for this. We proved out a certain viability of the 800-foot structure, so this was easy to talk about, especially in this context, because the fire district is right here off the screen. We could do this no problem just off the screen. We wanted to be here. So they just imposed a few constraints on us. 150-foot radius from a fire hydrant. Oops, didn't mean to blast you. We're on the river, so there's no, it's the river. And then I think it was a 60-foot setback from the closest adjacent property. So this is approved. It's one of the few timber projects that are actually, we don't know if it's going to get built yet, but at least we have an approval letter. Yep.
And so this is another sort of study that we're doing, and we're trying to look at also, so if we're studying that module one at a time, how do we also put them together and transport them? So we kind of had a fun idea. the Chicago River is still a very active river in terms of transportation and industry. Concrete industry actually uses it the most for barges, so we'll need to do something with our barges when timber takes over. So we thought we would do a study of how these modules come together and could be transported. And we actually engineered this exact layout of them so that this is something that we're ready to go with and that we could test. So we're kind of like looking for partners right now in this. And Chicago's had 2 architecture biennials now, and so we're kind of hoping that for the next one, which will happen in about a year and a half, or maybe less. But anyway, that we're hoping that for that next biennial that this might be a viable thing to kind of kick this off. And part of what's interesting about it in that sense is making the public more aware of this and raising that level of comfort. So I think you said the question would be asked again and again, is this safe? And so the more that we, keep talking about this, just like everything else, the more we keep talking about it, the more we keep demonstrating its viability, the more likely it is to actually.
And attempting to prove it in a scalable way. You still have the larger concept, but root everything that we're doing at that smaller scale in a more manageable form.
Yeah. So it's like a fun project, but at the same time testing some of the realities of the transportation and assembly and prefabrication. And looking at using it as this kind of floating pavilion so that you could have a gallery space, or there could be a farmer's market that takes place, and this could happen during the summer months, and then maybe it gets disassembled and these pods show up along the riverfront for the winter months to serve as kiosks or warming huts or things like that for other activities. So, and then we can reassemble it again the next summer.
When we presented all of this to the city, the building commissioner loved it so much she wanted to keep the boards, and she said she has them in her office, so we'll see. But I guess what that gave us the opportunity to do was really just start rolling our sleeves up on the next phase of this. We intentionally engineered the pavilion at that scale, so again, we could quantify some things, right? Not just let's solve what we think we can at this moment. So this is, so it was fully engineered with TT. We also broke the purity of only timber. So we started looking, going back to the slide of steel, concrete, and wood, where could concrete and steel be appropriate in the context of what we've designed for the tower? So these are some images of Cambridge test. So having real sizes of the members, that's what Cambridge is taking back to their labs and doing their research on. I don't know the full story behind this one. This was a compression test of one of the members that we sized, and I'm told that this one on the right, 360 millimeters by 360 millimeters, actually broke the machine the first time it's been brought to capacity, so Michael says, which is kind of amazing if you think about that. Then we were also approached by Autodesk and their new build space in Boston to fabricate a full-size mock-up of one of these modules. So this was about 6 months ago or so. Again, partnering with TT just to think about, just to sort of refine some of the structural details. And I think the takeaway here is, where does steel want to work? It wants to work at the connection node. But then you have fire protection. So concrete, encasing the steel in concrete, gives us two things. It fire protects the steel, but it also enhances the compression forces of the diagrid. And when there was a comment earlier that wood smells good. When this first came into our office, this is sitting on our 18th floor. Everyone that came up to that floor, it just took over. It changed the quality of the whole space. And it was another unexpected bonus. This is a model we just had built. The project's part of the new, Chicago Architectural Center. They just changed their name. Part of their innovations in high-rise exhibits. And then a video. Silence.
Should whistle something. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sure.
If I could invite the 4 presenters to the table. This final session will be moderated by Jennifer Bolstad, who is a founding principal of local office, landscape, and urban design, and a faculty member at Parsons. With a firm committed to address the urban and landscape issues of resilience, Jennifer is uniquely situated to lead this conversation on the relationship between urban development and global ecology. Please welcome Jennifer and the panel to the final table.
Thank you to our panelists. That was really inspiring. So I have the marvelous job here at Parsons of teaching the third semester architecture studio. And I know we don't often use this word in the graduate school context, but I think it really applies. The term sophomore, which, to go back to, thank you. To go back to the Greek, translates to wise fool. And not to insult any of my students, but I think it's really a wonderful moment in their education where they're just getting their feet underneath them as architects, and then we throw them into this studio that is at the ecosystem services and urban design scale, and they suddenly realize that they've kind of been looking at making objects in a vitrine, and suddenly they realize that design is a practice that has very, very long tentacles into things like markets and supply chains and social and environmental justice. And I think really more than anything, all of these presentations have illustrated just how far-reaching our profession is as architects, just how broad our impacts can be, and especially when we look at an innovation as revolutionary as urban timber architecture and architecture made of timber at the scale of the city, we see how broad those social implications can be. I think about the implications that something like alternative energy or passive house have had for affordable housing, where these are technologies that started out being kind of only in the reach of the fairly wealthy and a certain very limited category of building, and that have now translated down to a level where they start to be tools for improving economic outcomes for vulnerable populations. And I was hoping each of you could just comment on how timber in the city advances those ideals of social justice.
Well, I'll start. I know it's kind of hard to hear. I guess I would just say, can you hear me okay? Doesn't really sound. I kind of just go back to bringing the nature indoors. I was talking to Todd last night, and I'm spoiled where I live and in nature and the beautiful settings, and it grounds me, and I don't have to be on medication because of that. If I didn't have that, I mean, no wonder people are on meds. But so everybody should have that. Everybody should have that. And I think using timber in the city for expansion and growth is one way that we can help bring the nature and connect people with their natural settings, which is so critical. I think our disconnect to nature is one of the biggest problems we have related to almost everything, really. So, I mean, that's pretty broad, but I'm going to go with it.
Well, and Annie, something that also really struck me from your presentation and an aspect of timber construction that I myself had not considered before is, especially at a time when it seems like, the urban and rural communities in our country are have very different goals and perspectives. You spoke about how the use of timber in the city actually connects and aligns those objectives. By using timber in the city, you create a market that drives up good jobs and connects directly into impacts on those communities, in timber producing regions.
Right. So if we can do it in a way that benefits everyone, I think is key. Mm-hmm.
To me, I think just speaking to what I just talked about, the scalability, I think, of the prefabrication opportunities are the most interesting, because, unlike a suburban development where you're basically building a home on a slab, there's a fruit stand outside of our office, and the guy that runs it, I just hang out and talk to him every so often, but he's really interested. He sells fruit and has a skateboard troupe that he travels to Africa. He's from Africa, and he brings his kids over there. And he's been obsessed with just thinking of a shipping container housing solution that he could, establish in the States or there and kind of work vice versa. And when we started having that conversation, it just immediately drew me to the opportunities just across the world, not only in an urban context, but in other countries, and just housing in general. And I think that's why, not only because we were working on residential at the time, but also just picking a specific typology to really refine some of these ideas, I think opens up a very social opportunity.
Right, and to double down on what the other people are saying, and also what I think was at the core of a lot of the presentation material we had today. This is a technology that has the potential to help us on the environmental side, where the benefits are clear, in terms of bringing nature into our built environments, especially in the city. I am a city person. It doesn't bother me quite as much, but I would love to have more natural materials in the places where I live and work. I mean, our offices are awful. There isn't a natural material in the entire floor, and so to be able to incorporate that more, both in housing and in office, would be fantastic. But I think ultimately, especially from the developer perspective, anything that we can prefabricate is going to be the key to driving down housing costs, building costs across the board.
And waste.
And waste. And they're out of control. And and the fact is that a place like the greater New York City region, so we're talking about New York City, North Jersey, and out into Connecticut, is projected to increase its overall population. I don't even know the exact figures, but I know that we're looking at 20 years of sustained growth coming our way. Costs are going to go through the roof across the board. And so if we can't find a way to do it sustainably, both from an environmental and from a financial perspective, we've created more problems than we've solved. And timber provides us with one potential tool to use, I think.
We actually, we're wrapping up a project right now. It's under construction that includes senior housing as part of the program. It's a library and senior housing project in Chicago. And we had every intention of using timber, and we actually pushed it for a very long time. It felt like a natural sort of completion to that population. It's a low-income senior housing located adjacent to a park, so we worked hard to maximize views to nature, bring in natural ventilation, use healthy materials, and that's where this started to come in, was through healthy materials and biophilia, and ultimately the cost was what pushed it out, both of material and the labor costs, and also we weren't able to meet our requirements for MWBE, for skilled labor, for this type of construction, which I actually see as an opportunity for them to get in the game on this. So.
Just to add to that, one thing that, and we were talking about this a little bit last night, one thing that's was mentioned by Andrew in his talk, one thing I think that's becoming a common theme in our office, and it isn't necessarily the most efficient way to design a project. In the library and housing, a school that I recently worked on, we're designing 2 projects at once that we typically get through design development until we price them. And I don't, part of it's Midwest, right? It's location, it's where you're at. But we're just, it's the cost, it's the labor force. There's no one that actually knows how to do this. Or if it was in Oregon or something like that, it'd be a different story. But I think it's the persistence, it all makes sense to us. So we just do it because it makes sense. And then I think the more we keep pushing that, the more it opens up the opportunities to think of that.
So you've all talked about, various barriers to entry for timber in the city. What are the biggest obstacles, and, how can we as design professionals push on those obstacles, whether it be cost, fitting it into a pro forma, issues of code, especially we talked a lot about fire code, supply chain issues, externalities in the pricing. What do you see as those barriers, and what are the steps to start taking them down?
I think the biggest barrier, bar none, is code right now. I mean, there isn't any other way around that. that particular topic. You know, I see some good friends in the audience here who had a run-in with New York City code officials trying to do similar stuff, and I think a lot of us are familiar with it. We're starting to see some positive movement in terms of the code. We think that the national codes are going to change as early as next month, after a very, very long process. But there's also, I don't want to be too negative, but at a certain level, something kind of absurd about the way they're changing the codes. So they're saying, okay, we're going to allow you to build taller and larger with timber because we understand all the benefits here and we believe the science. But almost reflexively, we're going to make you cover that up with drywall.
So
Why the hell am I going to do that? That's just nuts. You know, like there's no reason to do that. But there is still, I think, you know, the code officials are doing what code officials have to do, and they're responding to what I think is kind of a reflex response on the part of other people who are involved in this conversation. Your diagram about the fire district in Chicago is perfect. I mean, the idea of putting a mass timber tower in the middle of the city with the most famous fire in North America is those memories die hard. Let's put it that way.
So well, just to tack on to that, you know, I've actually sat down with city officials 3 times on this project, and we held a conference. We presented at a conference about 1.5 years ago, and we invited the Chicago fire commissioners. We actually had fire commissioners from New York there as well. And during the Q&A, I don't remember which one it was, but he was just very passionately adamant about they trust us to do the right thing. They trust us to engineer it. They trust us to, you know, be professional about what they're doing. Their biggest fear is, and to your point about covering it up with drywall, which is kind of the dichotomy of the thing, their biggest fear is what happens after it's built. Mm-hmm. If someone rips that drywall off to remodel their unit, everything that you've built into it is gone. So when you think about stripping everything down to its purest materiality, and that's one thing that we're still trying to keep at the forefront of what we're doing in the research. Mm-hmm. Design it to not need any of that stuff. Mm-hmm. Just keep pushing that, because then there is no reason, you can't do that, right? It just is what it is. So
I would say just one more thing in Chicago is, and I assume it's very similar here in New York, maybe, is unions, and it's competition. And that is part of the dialogue, another dialogue that we've been trying to have with the concrete union and with the steel unions about, and how they're part of the process as well. It's not getting rid of them, and it's not, so anyway, it's another barrier a little bit.
The first time we presented went public, within 2 weeks I got a call from the American Institute of Steel Construction, and our client got a call from got a call from the concrete industry. We just invited them over. I mean, you know, it is, you know, you have to force the discussion, right? I mean, and again, I think we're in the middle of all that, but you know, it's what we do, I guess.
So the revolution may be beginning with some baby steps, like the proof of concept, being able to build your sales center as a small module out of a much larger ambition. And, I think it underscores, a point for us as designers that, each project still has to be viewed as the designed experiment, where we're putting something out in the world to test it, and it's brushing up against all of these regulatory obstacles and whatever other obstacles, and that it's our job to stay in the trenches and keep fighting that battle. I have many other questions, but I'm sure our audience does as well, so I'll open it up for the broader group to pose questions.
Thank you. Is there any trouble getting insurance companies to insure these buildings?
Sounds like a question.
Do you know any good insurance agents? Honestly, it's a question we haven't gone as far with as we should have. My understanding of the market is that it can be done. They've demonstrated it in other places. They're certainly doing more of it in the Northwest. They've done some in Minneapolis. They've done a lot in Canada. And so we think it's a solvable issue. Until we are a little further down the road, I won't be able to answer honestly.
Good afternoon. I'm trying to connect the two panels. I came in kind of late for the last panel, but I was really fascinated by the discussion. One of the ideas was, wood is being used as an industrialized material rather than as a natural material. And the forms that you are looking at are industrial forms. They're modular, they're stackable. And I'm wondering, which is appropriate for what you're doing, but we have students here who are going to do this competition. And I'm wondering if we could, just for a moment, think more speculatively. You talked about, what does the what does timber want to be? But could we ask the question, what does a city want to be that's made out of timber, that's not the modular, stackable city, that we find a way to create that, industrialized modular form using timber, but asking the other question, what does the city want to be that uses timber?
I mean, just maybe a quick point to that. There's a landscape architect that we partner with quite a bit. I'm going to give it over to you. But if you step back and think of how can that industrialized component of it actually be the medium to grow the city, right? So, okay, now you can.
No, I mean, yeah, he's stealing my answer. But we had a lot of fun with this, actually, and it's kind of to your point, I think, about how could this change the landscape of the city. And I mentioned it super briefly, but could we reintroduce, in the same ways that we're studying growing food and raising fish or livestock in the cities in small ways, like what are ways that we could bring forestry in and regenerate the building material, or say in the same ways that we have to offset carbon, like you have to grow more trees before you can build with more trees. Or, I think there's a lot of interesting opportunities for what that looks like as a landscape. I think it's a really good question.
That's a hard one to answer, but I think if I were going to approach it myself as a design problem, the thing that excites me the most is the small scale prefabrication rather than large scale modular, personally, and the opportunities that opens up to allow for a variety of different solutions, so that it's not one size fits all, and so it's not a super modular approach to everything. I mean, we show an office building. An office building is a blank slate that people expect to use in a certain way. There's a certain way that it needs to perform, and so it ends up being very, very modular in approach. But if you can break down the elements that you're prefabricating in such a way that they can be combined with far more flexibility and far more ability to kind of think about projects individually, that's an exciting part of prefabrication in general to me, rather than just strict modular. I don't know if that really gets to the point of how wood changes that perspective. Honestly, I don't have a good answer for that. I don't know if...
I don't really have anything. I was just going to point out that Tom and some of the other previous panelists spoke to how okay, so this cross-laminated timber and other mass timber construction is trying to emulate the current materials that are being used in buildings, steel, concrete, but maybe take a step back or forward actually and just look at, as its own material, then what do the buildings look like, then what do the cities look like? That's maybe what you're getting to. Some of the other panelists did touch on that. Okay, let's maybe get out of the mindset of having this timber operate like these other materials, and wait a minute, how does it operate, and what do those buildings now look like, and what do our cities now look like? Maybe they're not all super tall, maybe they're not the way our cities look like now because it is a different material completely altogether. So maybe that's what you're.
Yeah, I wonder if, we're sort of have a particular bias with this panel because the examples we've looked at are skyscrapers or, getting into at least, mid to very high-rise buildings. And, maybe the timber city of the future is more at the neighborhood scale so that it stays at the scale that a tree grows, that a forest grows. And I think, again, that's another area where, there's room for more exploration, more proof of concept, more of the, small scale building up of experimentation that starts to then, sway the codes and regulations that make this possible.
I think it's important you have to look at both, though, because you have to accept density. So you have to look at the urban planning aspect of it, too. So I think studying both in parallel, what does it mean for density? What does it mean for low? If you're going to do it, cover the whole gamut.
Hi. I guess my question's for Annie. What was really interesting to me was what Jennifer brought up in her sort of first question about that rural to urban disconnect, a history in this country of sort of land ownership and family ownership. It was interesting to me that I saw the Black Family Land Trust and like that you were getting into these sort of working with organizations in terms of the heirs property about like land ownership with the sort of renewable source of forestry. How is it that you sort of did that? Like what?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know how it came to be. I will find out. I'm relatively new with the organization. I don't know all the history, but I do know that there's a strong relationship with Indigenous people in Canada, and so I think taking that model and then looking at it, and particularly starting in the U.S. South and understanding what the current landscape is, what it was, what it should be, and then meeting with those folks and having conversations and starting to build those relationships to get it back to where it is probably more ideal to have as far as ownership and management and that kind of thing. So I don't know how it originally started, but I'm guessing it was modeled after what takes place in Canada currently with the Indigenous people.
Since I'm right next to you. Yeah. Hi, thank you for your presentations. I guess I have a kind of a supply and demand question, because if we all imagine an incredibly successful future for timber in the city, in thinking about your presentation, Annie, and the well-being of the forest, I wonder if in 50 years, if we do start to see tall buildings going up all over the country, do our forests have the capacity to handle it? Do the sustainability practices, the conservation practices that are in place have to change if this becomes successful?
Well, I guess if you jump ahead decades and the supply is exponentially greater, perhaps, but currently the management standards that we hold to certificate participants and chain of custody participants are such that it's responsibly managed forests sustainably now and into the future. So whether or not the capacity grows to an extent where we can't supply that and maintain that, I'm not sure. That's probably a ways away with the demand needing to increase in order for that to be an issue. But currently, the standards are such that forests are managed sustainably. So you can harvest and replant and do that years and years and years. That's what it's all about, preserving them for future forests. So currently, it is sustainable. Whether or not it grows and then now we have to figure out something else, that would be a good problem to have, I think.
I have a follow-up question to that, which is, are you starting to see the impacts of climate change on the forestry industry? For example, I know the USDA hardiness maps are changing, so effectively our forests are migrating north, which makes me think of trees, packing up their suitcases and moving north. But it really just means the species aren't growing in the same places. But then you also have things like, new blights, new invasive species, so are we looking at a future where timber depends on a monoculture, or can we increase the biodiversity in our forests and still supply this industry?
Yeah, I think it's critical to have the biodiversity. It's all connected, and you have to have it all in order to make it sustainable. So, but yeah, if the growing, what is it, zone 4 is now zone 3, or, zones are moving up, and, General Mills and Cargill food folks here in the Twin Cities, from my background, that's their supply chain issues, because they're growing now. They can't, so their supply chain is being affected. So it's a valid question and concern, but I think you need to maintain the integrity of the whole biodiversity of the forest in order to maintain that quality of all the benefits that we need and reap from.
And I guess it also pushes the onus back to us as design practitioners in that material research to always be searching for more and more species that can be adapted to this use. And I guess I would then look at the other side of that question of climate change and ask the rest of our panelists, what are the advantages of timber construction for survivability through natural disturbances, things like climate adaptability and passive house, thermal massing, light and air advantages. Are there aspects of timber construction that make them uniquely resilient and survivable?
Well, you guys are the pros, but I was just going to add that what I've learned is that your HVAC systems are different for timber than steel and concrete. So I think that speaks to your question right there alone, probably lesser need for bigger HVAC. Sorry, didn't mean to jump in.
I think every material has pros and cons that just have to react differently. So I never actually like to say we solve anything, right? We just generate more questions. So I think that's something that over time we just understand more about it and figure out how to just adapt. It's the same thing with forests, right? If demand increases and you don't have enough, what do? There isn't really an answer. You just have to be agile and be a problem solver. That's
right, and it's why it's one part of a much larger set of solutions, right? It's not going to solve all the problems that we have, and if we reach a certain point where capacity becomes an issue, obviously we couldn't extend past that. In terms of the lifetime and survivability of the buildings, their relationship with the environment around them, I think that's a difficult question to answer, because I think that while we're looking for solutions on how to build buildings more sustainably, I don't know that we're thinking very clearly about how those buildings are going to react to a changed environment in 20, 30, 50 years. And that's a much tougher issue for the entire design community. And it's one that hits home, I think, most frequently, at least in the work that I've done in this region, on when it comes to flooding, sea level rise, things like that. Which I couldn't say that timber is going to have any specific impact on that, but it certainly informs a lot about how we are master planning larger developments, how we're thinking about building and where we should be building, which also speaks to the insurance question that somebody asked earlier. And so I've seen far more of an impact on those kinds of considerations in building. Because we're having to rapidly react to things that are already changing, I think in a way that people don't really always recognize or understand truly. Just the new flood standards in New York City they aren't actually new. They just started applying them a few years ago. And I remember being halfway through a major project when they started applying them, and we were sort of like, oh wow, this changes everything.
Same thing happened on our Chicago.
Yeah, so it's those kinds of concerns, which that's such a large topic. It probably needs a whole nother conference on it by itself. In terms of how wood would stand up to that, I don't know actually. I think I would hope that it helps a little bit. It helps in terms of the HVAC we use and things like that. Certainly we're designing buildings in a different way. More insulation, better HVAC units, more natural light, and those things will continue. You know.
So I just want to quickly mention the four-letter word again, fire. Is the sustainable forest management include trying to prevent these massive forest fires, and are they sort of viewed as inevitable? And are the fires worked into sort of what the carbon that they release into the atmosphere? Is that part of the model you're looking at?
So I'm not an ecologist by at any stretch of the means, but I do know that the extent of the forest fires recently have to do with, in addition to the climate change effects that it's having, but also that the trees have not been harvested. So you've got fuel building up in the form of dead trees and fallen trees and just trees. And they need to have their natural cycle of burn, but they haven't been able to, I don't think, do that as much with as they did historically, just due to the way that development has happened. But it's when you harvest the trees and the forest, then those burn cycles are not so huge because you don't have all that built up fuel ready to go. It's best I understand it.
I just wanted to ask, I think, Annie, what percentage of forests in this country are sustainably managed?
We have a lot of stats that I didn't throw at you, so I'm sorry, and I don't have them all memorized. I know that SFI certifies 300 million acres in North America. I think FSC certifies 200 in North America. They also span to globally. So they have they certify forests. We have a certification management program that needs to be followed. So much more relevant here in the North America. So I can tell you we have 300 million acres in North America, and that we are 25% of the global certified forests for properly managed forests. Your question was, what percent of forests? I don't know that offhand, but I can certainly be happy to get that to you.
Are you the only ones who manage forests here, sustainably?
No, there's FSC. You saw their logo a couple of times in reference. They are one as well. SFI, they're both FSC and SFI are recognized in LEED certification. There's also Family Tree Trust, which is a smaller organization, and so an inclusive program with varying certification programs is best, because different forests operate in different ways, and some are small, some are large, some are overseas, some are here, some are more threatened than others. So having the right certification for the forest is what's right. So I don't know the percent here, but I can happy to get that for you.
Yeah, it's a follow-up question. Sure. I was wondering that in the United States, realizing all these different organizations, all these certifications, but as a country itself, is there a government agency that enforce that kind of standards? Because today, from what I understand, it's pretty much just leave up to individual to enforce it.
So there's not, I don't believe, an agency that forces certification. However, in North America, I think I touched on that in my presentation, North America has really good, robust rules anyway. So we have pretty good, so we can go beyond. So deforestation is less of a risk here in North America than it is globally. So our certification programs, whether it's SFI, FSC here in North America, then you can focus on the benefits that go beyond the risk of deforestation. So improving ecosystems, the other things I mentioned, community engagement, involvement, and those kinds of things, because deforestation in North America is not as much of a risk as it is globally, because of the infrastructure that we have for good laws.
Hello. First of all, thank you for the presentation. I think it was wonderful. So I feel there has been always a pushback for biophilic architecture, just because, especially when you're at areas that have expensive real estate values, there's a pushback between the designers and what they think it should be the best for the occupants, but then there's the developer side of things, that it's like the square footage is translated to rentable space. And in your experience, how those type of conversation has been, dealt with? Thank you.
Was it sort of pushed back compared to design ideals? Was that, I couldn't really.
Yeah, to paraphrase the question, there's been a pushback historically against biophilic architecture that seems to primarily be based on, not conforming with developer goals or not conforming with city goals. And, what's your response to that?
I think it's still there. I think part of what we were trying to demonstrate in the things that we were working on, and we were working with the developer that we were working, we were hypothetically working with them, having these conversations that we were working on that master planning project with. And basically, if we could get them the efficiency, and then with the uptick in how important amenities are, and those amenities dealing with health and wellness as well. So that's kind of an increasing value add. Though I feel like it's starting to be more of a selling point. So those conversations are getting a little, I don't know, I felt like they were getting a little bit closer to being something that would ultimately make the money.
In defense of the dark side. Yes. When what people want changes, industry changes with it. If those goals are aligned, I don't feel like there's a pushback from the development side in terms of being against biophilic design. We're developers trying to do it. There are hurdles to overcome. There's the code. Can't by ourselves change the code. We can't by ourselves change perception in terms of whether or not people feel these buildings are safe. We can certainly work on that problem. But as long as there is a demand from the people that we serve, who are ultimately the people who occupy our buildings, for this sort of design and for this sort of interior space, and also for this sort of environmental performance, the industry will raise its standards to get there. And that's what we're actively working on right now. And so I do see that in the long term, because of the way things have changed, especially in the United States, because that's primarily where we're working, that pressure has changed from both of those angles, that the building industry is going to change, and that we're going to start supplying more of this type of product. I think that you can point to a large number of projects that have been on the board specifically in New York City in the last few years that have attempted to actually, where developers and builders and architects have been behind the idea of building these types of spaces, and they've essentially failed because the codes aren't there, and so that's been the sort of pushback. So those things have to change. It's not the only thing that has to change. I'm not trying to blame it all on one particular thing, but I think the market is there already. So.
To add to that a little bit, I think, if you think of architects and developers as partners, like we both have the same goals. You need an architect to help design great spaces. We need you to help give us work, right? The odd man out to me is the construction industry and the cost, where I don't think either of us really have, our hands are, that's the other variable that I think is a little more out of control,
Well, it is out of control, but I think for the scale of the scale and complexity of what we're looking at, which is not an overly tall building. We're building up to 12 storage. We're doing a lot of volume, but it's office space. It's Class A office space, but office space is not difficult to do. There's repeatability there, and if we can demonstrate, and they have in a couple of other cases, which is why we've gone this route, that we can build it in a shorter time frame, which ultimately we think we can with prefabricated mass timber pieces, we're going to save cost. And we're going to save cost on material and foundations, costs in labor, costs in the time frame that we're out on site. That's going to work, that's going to be a partial solution to the construction problem. The issues with construction costs in general and an industry-wide basis they're a much larger problem, and it's ultimately, I think, one of the key reasons why people are looking for these solutions. And so it's sort of driving this forward as a partial solution to that problem as well. But at the same time, while we're looking at this solution, we're also not holistically addressing the cost of construction.
Persistence and parallel efforts, it's just chipping away.
There maybe needs to be a much larger, there needs to be a much larger conversation in the United States about the cost of building. Because ultimately that's not sustainable.
Living in 29th Street between 5th and Broadway and surrounded by 5 construction projects going up, including a big project right across the street, I want to raise a 5-letter word, which is noise. Earlier there was reference to the sound quality within the spaces of a heavy timber construction building, but what about, have there been metrics actually run on the comparison of noise production in a standard large building versus a timber construction building, and the influence on the well-being of citizens in a city? The less visible qualities of the benefits potentially of timber construction.
I'm sorry, do you mean during construction?
Yes.
As far as I know, no studies have been run on it. It would seem logical to me that it should be quieter, but I think we won't know until we try to actually build one ourselves, to be honest with you. But if you've got metal deck out there on site and people jumping up and down on it all day and hammering on it, if that's something that you can replace with mass timber, maybe you've solved part of that problem as well.
I think one thing, I don't know, it's just feels like it makes sense. If you're pulling a lot of that work off-site into prefabrication, the only work that's happening on site is putting the pieces together. So it seems like there should be a significant decrease.
Well, the speaker from the other day stated that the noise reduction was around 45%.
Yeah, I think he had some statistics on it as well.
That's a good question.
Well, I think that just about wraps up our time here. I want to once again thank all of our panelists for contributing your expertise today, and I want to thank our audience for sticking around on a beautiful Friday afternoon.
Thank you.
Let me just close by saying, just echoing Jennifer's comments and thanking all the presenters, panelists, as well as the generous support of the Binational Softwood Lumber Council for underwriting the event, the ACSA for coordinating the competition, and for Parsons School of Design and Dean Robert Kirkbride for allowing us to host this event here. I would also really like to thank, because it would not happen without their dedication, the administrative staff of School of Construction Environments, Kian, Bethany, and Darren, in addition to students who helped work on this, Andrew and Meredith, if they're here, and specifically Angela DeGeorge, who, if she can raise her hands, who really helped make certain that this could all come together.